Hello, and welcome to today's webcast on engaging your AI strategy maturation, brought to you by Insider Microsoft. Below this webcast, you will see an attachments tab where you can navigate to after this webinar. There you can find additional information on assets on today's topic. I would now like to turn over this presentation to our speaker, Carm Taglienti, Insight's Chief Data Officer. Carm, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Carter, and thank you everybody for joining. It's great to be here, and I'm really looking forward to talking to you about AI strategy maturation and custom copilots as you think about centers of excellence. Okay, so what are we going to be talking about? So we'll talk about the benefits of maturing AI strategy. What are some of those key elements of successful strategy as it relates to AI for business transformation, and then mitigating AI challenges and risks, because as we all know, there are definitely risks in here. And this is me. So I've been in the industry for quite some time. I'm also an educator. I teach at Northeastern University, and I focus in on this whole AI space, including data, which is going to be an important part of what we talk about today. Okay, so I was talking about ROI of AI, which is hard to say, but in general, we want to really understand how is it that we're going to get benefit from AI. And so I like to talk about it in sort of the cyclical model. It starts with just understanding what are some of the stakeholder priorities and goals. What is it that you're looking to do? Now, we all know the benefits of AI, at least we've talked a lot about them ever since the introduction of ChatGPT. Even before that, actually, to get into a history lesson, since the 50s, we've been talking about AI, but we did go through in the 90s and the early 2000s, the AI winter. So in general, though, it's sort of back again, but now it's a little bit more democratized. So with the advent of the new generation of AI, including ChatGPT and chatting with your data and the large language models, we have the ability to really take advantage of some of these capabilities to drive our business forward. So as I was talking, the stakeholder priorities really have to do with what is it that we're looking to do financially? What are our goals? What drives our competitive advantage within the organization? And if we're interested in operational efficiencies, how do we drive operational efficiency? So these are the three big areas that I would typically focus on. The next thing we want to do is go through sort of this what if concept or ideation. Explore, how am I going to assess, identify, or validate the technology that might be most appropriate? It's not always AI that's able to solve your particular problem in a specific way. You might actually just use some simple reporting, for example. It doesn't always have to be AI, as I said before. So in general, we want to make sure that we're aligning the right techniques to solving the problems that we're looking to achieve, or the goals we're looking to achieve. So that's a big part of this. So sometimes people always think that AI is the solution. So I want to make sure that we understand very specifically, and this is where we can help as well, just to help you to understand, is AI the appropriate technique? And if so, how will it help you to drive value within your organization? Which kind of brings us to the next part. So what are the value enablers? So your data AI strategy, what's your data look like? Is your data ready for AI, for example? Or for your specific use case, how good is that data? Is the data going to allow you to be able to, say, provide expertise and intelligence that allows you to be able to address that particular need? Or even what kind of a portfolio might you already have as it relates to AI? You might already be matured in AI and using some AI techniques. Maybe you're using some, I'll call it statistical methods, linear regressions to be able to help you to predict what might happen in the future. And you might already be very mature in your reporting, for example, so that your data is really high quality and you're using it to drive decisions. So maybe you have some enablers already. So take stock of what those enablers might be. At that point, then, when you're getting that alignment as it relates to understanding what it is that you're looking to achieve, now you can start thinking about what is the value story, or what does it really look like? What is it going to take for us to start to drive actual value? So while we may be creating it, we want to think about what does it take to realize that value? So we end up sort of moving down this path of understanding what the story is. So the story is going to be related to achieving the goals, but taking advantage of the enablers that we have already made available to our organization heretofore. So now we start looking at what are some of those benefits to the organization. So this way we can see when we start to realize that value, we can align it back to the goals and say, well, check out these metrics that we've been able to identify as it relates to, for example, operational efficiencies. How are we improving? What's the degree to which we are improving? And then what's the overall value to the organization? So the benefits are going to be really important. And we can even start thinking about things that maybe aren't just financial in nature or operationally efficient. We can start thinking about things like maybe we are looking at customer retention or acquisition as it relates to competitive advantage, or even employee engagement. So more efficiency within our own employee staff to be able to come to work every day and enjoy their jobs because they're not doing these mundane tasks that were being done before. Sometimes automation can be part of that, but AI is part of that as well. So those benefits, I think, are key as you think about sort of realistic value realization. And then we start thinking about how do we exploit this? So now we leverage these capabilities, and then we look at how do we then optimize and reinforce and continue to grow. So exploitation is a really important part of it. So it's not only just the fact that we have this great value that we've created, but it's now how do we leverage it? How do we realize it or exploit it? And then finally, at the end of all of this, we would have identified in the beginning the stakeholder priorities and goals, and now we really can realize that stakeholder impact. So how is it that we were able to achieve success where we look at stakeholder impact, and then we want to continue, right? So where do we go from here? We evolve, innovate, grow, and sustain those capabilities, and we start the cycle again. And so if we sort of move into this kind of a cycle as it relates to AI, we have the ability to quickly identify what are those things that we want to do to help drive the business. And then it helps us to be able to understand how do we take value from it, because that's why we make those investments. And this is really important as well, because in the early days of AI, if you want to call it that, but for the last decade or so, many of us had AI teams. We invested in AI, we had capabilities, but we never really took advantage of it. And so now we have the ability to be able to do this quickly with the democratization of AI in the form that we see it today. And clearly Microsoft is helping in this way to be able to add AI capabilities to the Office suite to allow us to be able to create custom Copilots, that allow us to be able to code more effectively with things like Copilot for GitHub. So there are a lot of different ways that we can think about using AI in the context of increasing productivity, but also allowing us to be able to do more across the board. Okay, so if we're thinking about envisioning our ROI, we identify the use case. So first we identify what is the problem that you're looking to solve. You move in and check for the opportunity. What data will support it, or even do you have the data that will support it? And this is something that we did back in the early days of AI. You have to certainly, before you can start creating a model or to realize some kind of hypothesis, you had to first make sure that you had the data to do it. So that's a really important part of it. And how much effort do you put into sort of curating that data? So you don't want to boil the ocean. We'll talk about data as well, but as you think about the data platform, or is your data ready for AI, you can't spend 2 years cleaning your data because you'll miss your opportunity. So the idea here is to make sure that you have the data ready to go and then ready to move forward. And then envisioning that outcome and understanding, does solving the problem have a potential to save you money, sort of going through that cycle that I was talking about. And then how would you measure it? So the quantifying the impact at its most granular is like, what would this look like? So you can actually get to the point where you identify either quantitatively, this is exactly what I'm going to save in terms of maybe resource costs, or even more qualitatively in terms of, say, improved performance, which ultimately turns into maybe better customer retention. So you can start to move there. So sort of calculating this is important, and anybody that's ever done a business case is very familiar with this concept. So let's talk a little bit about where are we in generative AI today, or AI more generally, is, if we think about what are some of the concerns and challenges that we have to allow us to be able to be successful with this ROI concept, we want to think about, first of all, this cycle that I have on the left. Identify what is the outcome, evaluate the effectiveness to accomplish the goal, and then determine the appropriate level of automation that might be required. So for example, are you going to constantly sort of use DevOps pipelines or CI/CD pipelines to be able to build AI into your applications, including generative AI strategies and techniques? Are you going to constantly update your knowledge base or your cognitive services database in order to make sure that it's as up to date as possible in order to drive forward your the best intelligence possible to be able to make decisions within your organization. And then this last one, I think, is going to be one of the ones that's really important to us. Ensure ethical considerations are met. So what are those use cases? And then how are we ensuring that we're using this data in the AI sense responsibly? We've had GDPR for quite some time. The California Privacy Act, for example, is another one where we really just need to think about protecting consumer data. And so it's important for us to understand what are some of those ethical considerations, because we are the stewards of data. So we need to make sure that we are protecting it and the intelligence that comes from it. So that's something you should think about as well. And there are, of course, data security and privacy challenges, which I listed a whole bunch of them here. I won't read them all to you, but in general, it really just has to do with ensuring that when we touch the data, when we derive intelligence from that data, are we able to understand, is there a potential impact in terms of security and privacy along with that data? So just a couple examples here. One would be, as we're accessing our data, is it only accessible to those who require access to that data for the purposes of achieving their job goals? So that would be one area where we ensure that only those that are authorized to see certain data can see the data, even in the AI sense. And then the second one has to do with maybe it's derivative information in terms of protecting consumers' privacy, for example, which I just described. But you might say, if we are able to learn something about a particular individual, for example, maybe it's their political affiliation by, say, doing some analysis using AI techniques, then we want to be careful how we use that data, for example. Like, we don't want to make decisions or bias on it based off of what is intended to be private information about that individual. So clearly there are benefits, but there are challenges. And so you have to weigh the challenges and the benefits in order to be able to understand what it is that you need to do. And it's a pretty long list here, but in general, these are tractable. So we can think about compliance that we might put in place or biases that we might have. But if you identify what they are, then you can work in the context of understanding what some of those challenges are, and then be able to create solutions that address them, or at least talk to them. And what I always like to say in the challenges side, especially around things like security and privacy, is to ensure that you are monitoring the results of what it is that you're producing. So transparency provides a huge impact in terms of being able to do this effectively. So sometimes just measuring and monitoring can help you there. The benefits, of course, we all seem to understand, or at least I hope we understand, and I'll get into some of the benefits as we go. But in general, it is really this concept. And the reason Microsoft calls this a Copilot is because it literally is a sidekick. It's a Copilot. It helps you to be able to do more. And that's the idea. And sort of the things that you would typically either find to be either arduous as you go through the process of, let's say, generating text or documents, or even coding for that matter. You might say, okay, I don't remember the syntax of every single one of these particular functions, but I'm going to get help with a Copilot. It's going to help me create code that maybe is not only syntactically correct, but also allows me to be able to, say, build in maybe security policies or security trimming, so that it doesn't allow me to be able to create an application that could potentially be exposed to privacy threats or vulnerabilities that might exist. So there's some really cool ways that this can help us all out. All right. So I think we all know how it works, but let's just talk quickly about it. So we basically get index data from the world, so to speak, quote unquote, and it's a little bit of tongue in cheek, but all data that's available to a large language model is available to us to be able to use through the large language models. And we still, in some ways, don't know exactly what all the data was that it was trained on, like a GPT, for example. We don't know exactly what all the data is, but we know that it was data that was publicly available on the internet. So that usually comes from the large language model. Private information, though, comes from your own environment. Okay, and this is the data that you want to protect, but you want to make sure that you're running all of this in a private local tenant so that you're not exposing the kinds of questions that you might be asking, or even that private information, to the outside world. So that's the idea. And if you think about products that Insight offers, like Insight Lens for Gen AI, we give you the ability to do this in an effective way through an application, so that you don't have to worry about creating your own application or infusing it into your own existing set of applications. This Accelerator allows you to be able to do it much more quickly. And behind the scenes, then, it's all of the processes that are associated with getting that data, putting your data into cognitive services or a knowledge base or a vector database, as we like to call it, so that it is accessible moving forward. So that's really an important part of this. And then the idea here is that if you are able to collect the correct set of data, be able to orchestrate the environment, we call this a RAG strategy, at least the technique that we're using here. So it's a retrieval augmented generation strategy. And then what you can do with that then is based on the target audience, you can improve your business outcomes. And that's really the idea here. Architecturally, this looks like this or something like this. We leverage the Microsoft products in order to be able to create a custom Copilot. And so that's exactly what generative AI, the Accelerator, actually does for us. So what it does is allows us to be able to leverage the semantic kernel to be able to connect to cognitive services. As I mentioned up here, this is where all of your private intelligence is being stored. But one important part about this is that we are also using our Active Directory. Remember earlier I talked about security. So the knowledge-based search or extracting the data that is going to be used as part of the retrieval augmented generation mechanism can only be only information that should be provided to the authorized user will be used as part of that strategy. And that's the idea here as well. So we want to make sure that we are only using data that is available to that particular individual as part of their experience as they're going through the process of, say, chatting with their data or creating a sales document or creating a statement of work document or whatever it is that they might be looking to do. So that is another important part of it. For example, we're not going to want to make, say, all sales information of all of the executive team available to just anybody within the organization. We want to make sure that that information is protected, but it might be in this knowledge base because it may be required for other purposes, for example. So there are many, many ways that we can think about doing this, but security is going to be a really important part of this, and you want to ensure that you're providing security at the lowest level possible. So, and then just generally, I mean, we could spend a long time just talking about what the architecture looks like, but in general, we get to the point where we retrieve the data that is most appropriate to set context. We do that through the semantic kernel, which is basically the Microsoft infrastructure that allows us to create this kind of an AI application. And then we use that to send it to the Copilot service, or in this particular case, the Azure OpenAI service. And then we can send the results to either a Copilot service that is used or access it, or just use, in this particular case, the application that we're talking about. So there are lots of different ways that we can interact and get the data that is required in order to create the correct context to retrieve the most high fidelity data possible. And that's really what we're trying to do at the end of the day. So earlier I talked about how do you make this real? So it might be kind of a fun science project to be able to say, geez, I wonder if I can chat with my data, and I wonder if I can, maybe give it some new information and see if it's able to answer my questions. And that's really cool. And in the early days, that's what a lot of organizations were looking to do, proof of concepts. So how do I understand whether or not this actually works and kick the tires a little bit to make sure that it really sort of, it really provides the kind of value that I expected it to. But those projects actually turned into something a little bit more robust. So now they're turning into, a year later, into how do I actually productionalize this? Well, the only way to really think about productionalizing this is to leverage what I like to call the generative AI lifecycle. So basically, it starts with some of the things that we've already talked about as it related to ROI, which is really understand the business challenge, make sure that you pick the right type of model. Now, and you've seen this also over time, it's not just ChatGPT or the large language models that are associated with the OpenAI platform. There's a whole bunch more, a lot of open source models that are available today, like the Llama 2 models and others. And there's also multimodal types of models that you can use. So ones that will generate images, for example. So this is really something that we want to make sure that we understand. So first of all, understand what our goals are, then understand which model makes the most sense for what it is you're looking to achieve. Then we move into sort of an exploratory mode where we look at what kind of response were you expecting, and are you getting the types of responses you would expect? So here you can start to see, does the model actually know enough to be able to help me to get to the point where I want to be, even if it doesn't have all the context required? So you can do this really quickly, by the way. And so you can get up and running by really just connecting to a chatbot service and starting some of this, and then providing enough context through either prompt engineering or maybe even including your own documents to get to get up really quickly and not have to worry about building out a large knowledge base to get you there. So then once you've done this exploratory analysis and you're convinced that, yes, it is the right technique or the model's going to give me what I want, then you can think about, well, what technique do you want to use for additional knowledge? So there are basically two primary techniques, maybe a third if you want to think about it that way. But one is going to be prompt engineering, which I described. So will the model be able to provide most of what I need? And are the users going to be knowledgeable enough to be able to do prompt engineering and to be able to craft their questions in a way that allows the model to be able to return accurate responses to them? And that's number one. Number two is what we call this RAG strategy. So basically retrieval augmented generation. Retrieval augmented generation allows us to be able to say, okay, well, I'm going to use a knowledge base and I'm going to store knowledge from internal to my organization. And every time that I issue a query or interact with the large language model, I'm going to first check the knowledge base to see, is there any additional knowledge that the knowledge base can provide, add that to the question or the query, and then allow that to set context as the response is being generated from the large language model. So I'm determining that technique. That was number two. The third one is in cases where, let's just say, we know exactly what needs to be done and we don't necessarily have to go ahead and build a knowledge base. We're going to tune our model to be able to perform a very specific function. I can modify the model to be able to perform that function effectively by changing the parameters. So that basically is what we call fine-tuning or fine-tuning the model. So that may be a technique that you might want to do as well. So those are the primary three. The last one, which is the fourth one that I didn't really talk too much about, but if you want to build your own model, that's slightly different. If you do get to the point where you realize that any of those three techniques that I just described don't work very well for you, you might want to think about building your own model. That's a pretty big task in order to be able to do that. So if you do get there, though, we can certainly talk about it. But in general, those are the three that you should really think about. Okay, so moving to the next step. So then I get to I actually build it out. So I determine the technique that's going to work best for me. I build it out, and then I want to go through model evaluation. So I try it out. So is this actually going to give me the kind of responses that I'm expecting? And you might write test cases here to make sure that you understand, is it doing what I expect it to do before I kind of release it out into the wild? And then once you've done that, then you can say, is the model ready for business use? If it passed all the tests that you expected, you might have to go back to some prior steps to be able to do some, say, tuning of the environment, maybe adding some more data, maybe selecting another model. You can go back to as far as you would like in order to be able to make sure that you get the right kind of environment before you release into your production setting. And then once you're there, you would release the model, and then you would, up at the top here, model monitoring and efficacy, ensuring that it's continuing to provide the kinds of responses that you expect. Now, it doesn't always have to be a chatbot. It can also be through your applications. So what we're starting to see a lot of these days is embedding directly into your applications these AI capabilities. And so what you might see is a lot of these same features being built directly into applications. And certainly we're seeing it with all of the Microsoft Copilots. They're being built into the M365 platform. And so just about anything like Dynamics, for example, has its own Copilot, which is building in intelligence. Word, Excel, PowerPoint, they all have their own Copilots, which allow you to be able to do this effectively as well. Now, the thing that we're talking about here is sort of a general purpose capability. And in a lot of ways, where we've been focusing is how do you create more custom models, which are slightly different than the M365 versions, although you can actually leverage some of that same data over and over again. So the next question might be, well, how do you do this? Okay, and in addition to, it sounds like a great strategy. Well, in order to really do this, it's sort of based off of two primary areas or foundational areas. One is the modern application environment, and the second is the modern data platform. So in order to actually get this to create AI-enabled applications, you really have to think about, well, how much capability do I have in any one of those areas? Let's take the right-hand side to start. So first I start with the modern data platform. Do I have enough capabilities here in order to be able to say that my data is ready for AI so that I can create models that I can embed into my applications? Now you might find here that it's like, I don't have a good data storage strategy, or I don't have data governance and ops strategy, or maybe I didn't even have data services to be able to access my data. This is kind of a maturity model up and down this area. So if I don't have capabilities, then I might want to think about getting them. And once I've done all that, am I able to perform AI, BI, or even machine learning on top of that mature data platform? And that's key in order to be able to sort of achieve this goal of an AI-enabled application. Now, on the flip side of it has to do with your application environment. So if you're doing custom copilots or you're doing custom capabilities within this arena, you have to make sure that you have a solid application framework and approach to be able to develop these applications and then be able to update them and redeploy them. So I kind of get to this point where we start with not just development frameworks and architectural approaches, but we also think then about what platform are you running on, and then are you able to automate your deployment strategy? So do you have those embedded test cases? Are you able to deploy effectively? Because it's not a one and done model. So if you do have maturity in both of those areas, and it doesn't have to be enterprise-wide, it could just be within a specific domain, but once you're there, then you can create true AI-enabled applications. And that's the idea here. So we're trying to get to this point over time. Okay. If we think about what are some of the approaches that we addressed, some of the challenges that I talked about, especially as it relates to privacy and ethical concerns, I would think about things like anonymization of data, or maybe even differential privacy, or even fairness constraints, and then transparency and interpretability. So these are techniques that are being used. Some of these are actually making their ways into some of the regulations that are being produced today, for example. So let me just get into differential privacy, for example. So basically, we can add noise into the data stream, for example, to protect data privacy. So basically, we could use that to be able to maybe obfuscate some information potentially as it's coming out, or adding noise so that people can't actually tell what the ultimate result would be. Or fairness, for example, how do we prevent discrimination and build trust and sort of just monitor? And we can even use other AI techniques to help to identify, is this fair or non-biased, as we think about some of our data. So there are a number of different techniques that you can use. And again, we don't have a lot of time to get into all of these, but these are some things that you might want to think about. And when you start to see legislation being produced, you'll see that these are areas that are being addressed. The next thing I'll talk a little bit about is organizational policies for AI use. And if we think about, we already know a lot of the things that we shouldn't be doing, but we also want to make sure that we identify what it is that we can do. So making sure that we understand what those policies really are. So be specific and measurable so that we know what are the things that you can and can't do, which allow you to be able to leverage this capability because it's very powerful to the best extent possible for your organization or for your specific role. And training is a really important part of it. It's not just technology. If you think about also going all the way back to cybersecurity or the things that we've been living in for the last 5 or 6 years, maybe 10 years, we also have to think about what are the things that we can and can't do with data. Okay, so that's really an important part. Understand your role and understand how you can and should not use that data. So one of the important parts that I had talked about, and honestly, when you think about it, and it's not just because I'm a chief data officer, but if you look at the way that we use AI, if we think about the data, it's really all about the data at the end of the day. So if you're going to be making decisions or you're looking for AI capabilities or training of models on data, well, you want to make sure that your data is as reflective of reality as it possibly can be. So this is why it's really important to think about the data estate. Okay, so modernizing the data estate might be something, and I talked about maturity earlier. That's something that you might want to think about as you move forward. Now, as I was saying before, you don't want to spend all of your time just modernizing your data estate and then 2 years later saying, oh, I'm ready for AI. Well, that's not realistic. So what you can do is start to apply some of these strategies and principles early as you start to work through your use cases and demonstrate the value, going back to the value proposition. So this gets to the why does it matter? So here, as I said before, if you're going to start driving down this path of data-driven decision making, well, it is about the data. And if we think about AI or the intelligence part of AI, well, guess what? It's also making decisions off of your data, or at least helping to make recommendations to you about what those decisions should be. So that may be where you want to go. Okay, so there are many techniques that we can use in order to take advantage of this. And of course, Microsoft continues to make investments in this area. So whether it's, modern data warehouses or lake houses, or even things like Fabric, which allow us to be able to take care of or access data anywhere, this is really an important part. So you have to think about what are your data needs and requirements, and then what is the potential accessibility that you might want to think about in the future. I covered these in the maturity model, and this is really a big part of it. So as I was talking about sort of the maturity model concepts, we know that it drives ROI, but we also have to make sure that we understand how much of this and what investment do we want to make in order to take advantage of it. So like I said before, be careful not to just spend the next 2 years trying to get your data in order, because it is an evolutionary process. You'll never quite get there, but governance is something. If you establish governance and you leverage the culture of understanding how to curate your data, you can actually drive yourself as an organization to be an AI-ready organization and make decisions based off of that data. Okay. One of the things that I also like to just talk about is as an organization, we've been focusing on some of these with Microsoft, and we've created a suite of tools that allow you to be able to get there faster. So if you think about how do I create sort of quick modern data platforms, there's something called Lens for the modern data platform, or we've already talked about Insight Lens for ML or AI, which allows us to be able to sort of bring up the Lens capability for Gen AI much quicker. And this is the ability to connect to that large language model and to get yourself up and moving fast. And then there's also the AI CoE Accelerator. So I talked about governance. So CoE really allows you to be able to create best practices and principles that are related to an AI center of excellence. And then finally, of course, because of the dependency on data governance, there are data governance services that allow us to be able to enable you as an organization to be able to take care of your data estate. Now, finally, when we get to this concept of, we get to this concept of organizational maturity, it really allows us to be able to look at leveraging all of those capabilities together to be able to create AI-enabled applications. And that's really what this is all about. So organizational analytics maturity really just focuses on the ability to take advantage of those assets, derive insights for you by leveraging your AI, and then allowing you to be able to embed them into the decision-making tools that you might be using within your organization, whether it's standard reporting capabilities or applications where you might be making decisions along the way. So here's some examples of what this might look like. So retail organizations using Gen AI and augmented reality to improve customer experiences. I'm sure we've all seen these before. Or manufacturing companies using generative AI to optimize complex vehicle production schedules across multiple plants by doing things like modeling, for example, but also using the visualization capabilities to be able to understand what is the best approach. Okay, and then at the end of the day, how can we help? And so this model I've been talking about the entire time is basically just starting along that circular graph that I identified, and it also supports the value proposition ROI that I was describing earlier. So first we understand what it is you're trying to do, create alignment. We look to accelerate, so identify what are some of those quick hit capabilities that we can use by doing things like an MVP, and then moving into enterprise-wide transformation and governance. And this is the idea. And so you can sort of start fast, you start to accelerate capabilities, and then you move to the enterprise. And this is really what it's all about. And notice at the bottom, I've got here the value creation and value realization. So the idea here is that here are some examples of things that we can do: executive briefings, strategy workshops, looking at using the Lens for Gen AI accelerators to help get us up moving fast. And so these are really important concepts for us to be able to use. And then once we sort of get maturity within the organization, then we can start looking at the enterprise. And then once you're actually in true value realization, you're in a governed model. So you're starting to take advantage of these capabilities and drive them forward within your organization and doing them over and over again and continuing to recognize value, but also innovate. So you go back to the beginning and start to innovate more because you already have a governed approach. So I know that's a lot to cover in this small period of time, but in general, this is how we think about sort of ROI in the context of understanding how AI can be applied within your organization. And if you're ready to take the next step in your journey, scan the QR code, reach out to us. We would love to help you. It's certainly an area that we're very passionate about and one where we can look forward to helping you on that journey. Thank you, and thank you for your attendance.